Billionaire hires the world's worst assistant by mistake. She deletes his company, insults the board, and spills coffee on the Japanese investors. But her next move saves his dying grandmother's last wish. Before we begin, tell us in the comments, what is the clumsiest thing you have ever done at a new job? And at the end of the story, don't forget to rate it from 0 to 10. Enjoy. Dylan Sterling's world was a symphony of meticulously controlled silence. His days were measured in 15-minute increments on a digital calendar, his suits were arranged by color and fabric weight, and his coffee was always served at precisely 82 degrees Celsius. As the CEO of Sterling Innovations, a tech empire he had built from the ground up, he believed that chaos was a form of corporate treason. Emotion was an inefficient variable. Perfection was the only acceptable standard, which is why the arrival of Khloe Jensen felt less like a new hire and more like a natural disaster. The mistake began with a single typo. Dylan had instructed his HR department to hire the most qualified executive assistant in the country, a woman named Khloe Jensen, a legend in corporate circles with a resume polished to a mirror shine. However, a fateful slip of a finger on a keyboard resulted in an offer letter being sent to Khloe Jensen, a freelance graphic designer and part-time dog walker from Brooklyn who thought she was applying for a temporary creative assistant role. Khloe's interview, conducted by a junior HR manager in a hurry, had been a masterpiece of mutual misunderstanding. When asked about her organizational skills, she had enthusiastically described her system for color-coding her comic book collection. When asked about her experience with high-pressure environments, she told a lively story about the time she had to walk 7 dogs during a squirrel convention in Central Park. The HR manager, assuming this was some kind of quirky, metaphorical genius, had hired her on the spot. On her first day, Khloe burst into the silent, minimalist sanctuary of the 40th floor like a tornado made of bright colors and cheerful chaos. She wore a yellow dress covered in cartoon cats, mismatched socks, and carried a tote bag that proclaimed, "I'm not weird, I'm a limited edition." Dylan, who was in the middle of a serious conference call about server infrastructure, looked up from his desk and saw her standing in his doorway. He froze, his perfectly articulated sentence about scalable cloud solutions dying in his throat. "Hi," she chirped, her voice a full 2 octaves higher than anyone else's on the floor. "I'm Khloe, the new creative assistant. This place is super white. Does it ever get sad in here?" Dylan slowly placed his hand over the phone's microphone. "I beg your pardon? You know, all the white. It's like living inside a giant sugar cube. You guys should get a plant. Or a fish. A fish would be nice. We could name him Bartholomew." She looked around his office, her head tilted. "You have a lot of windows. That's good for the fish." For the first time in his professional career, Dylan Sterling was completely speechless. He ended his call with a curt, "We will continue this later," and stood up, his posture radiating a mixture of disbelief and barely controlled horror. "There has been a mistake," he said, his voice dangerously calm. "You are not a creative assistant. This is the executive office of a multi-billion-dollar technology firm, not a kindergarten art class." Khloe blinked, her cheerful expression faltering for a second. "Oh, the job ad said you needed someone to assist with creative solutions and dynamic workflow. I thought that meant you needed someone to help you guys liven up the place. My workflow is very dynamic. Yesterday I made a collage out of old magazines and then took a nap. Very dynamic." Dylan felt a headache beginning to form behind his eyes. He was about to call security, HR, and possibly an exorcist, but just then his personal assistant, a perpetually stressed but highly competent man named Arthur, rushed in. "Mr. Sterling, I am so sorry," Arthur stammered. "There was a clerical error. Miss Jensen had a family emergency." Miss Jensen was the next on the list. "We're trying to rectify the situation." "Rectify it, Arthur," Dylan said through gritted teeth. "Immediately." Khloe, who had been listening with wide-eyed interest, piped up. "So, does this mean I don't get to name the fish Bartholomew?" Before Dylan could rectify the situation, a genuine crisis erupted. A critical server that hosted the company's entire client database crashed. Alarms blared, and the tech team went into a full-blown panic. All our client data, our contracts, our financial records for the last 6 months are on that server. The head of IT shouted, his face pale. The backup system seems to be corrupted. Dylan, in full crisis management mode, strode into the server room, a space Khloe had never seen before. She followed, drawn by the flashing red lights and the palpable sense of chaos. "What's the protocol for a full system failure?" Dylan demanded. "We have to manually reboot from the master console and hope the data isn't completely lost," the tech lead explained. "But the console is locked behind a failsafe. We need to input the recovery sequence." The team huddled around the master console, a complex interface of buttons and switches. Dylan watched, his jaw tight, as his best technicians failed, one after another, to get the sequence right. "It's not working. The failsafe is rejecting every command." Khloe, who had been quietly observing from the back of the room, stepped forward. "Can I try something?" she asked. The entire tech team turned to stare at her. "Miss," the lead technician said with strained patience, "this is a highly complex system. It's not something you can just poke." "I know," Khloe said, "but you guys are all trying to do it in order. You're inputting the commands like you're reading a recipe. But it's not a recipe. It's a rhythm." She pointed to the flashing lights on the console. "See? They're not random. They're blinking in a pattern. It's like a song, a dum-dum-but-dum." She hummed a little tune, her fingers tapping on her leg. Dylan stared at her as if she had just started speaking in an alien language. "You're all pressing the buttons one at a time," she continued. "But what if you have to press 2 at once, like a chord on a piano?" Before anyone could stop her, she reached past the stunned technicians. "Let's see. If the green one is the dum, and the blue ones are the ba." Her fingers danced over the console, pressing a combination of buttons in a quick, rhythmic sequence that followed the pattern of the flashing lights. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, a loud beep echoed through the room, and the master console screen flickered to life. The word "recovery initiated" appeared in bright green letters. The entire room was silent. The tech team stared at the screen, then at Khloe, their mouths agape. Dylan felt the world tilt slightly on its axis. Khloe beamed, dusting off her hands. "See? It's all about the music. I used to be really good at that Dance Dance Revolution game at the arcade. It's kind of the same thing." She looked at Dylan, a proud smile on her face. "So, do I still have to go home? Or can I stay and name the fish?" Dylan looked at the woman in the cat print dress who had just saved his company's entire digital infrastructure by humming a tune. He looked at his team of highly paid MIT-educated engineers who were still staring at her in stunned silence. "Arthur," Dylan said, his voice a strange mix of awe and utter bewilderment. "Cancel the rectification. It seems Miss Jensen has a very dynamic workflow indeed." He had no idea that this was only the first, and by far the least chaotic of the disasters she would both cause and solve. Khloe Jensen's continued presence on the 40th floor was a source of constant, low-grade chaos that Dylan found both infuriating and inexplicably fascinating. She decorated her sterile, white cubicle with fairy lights and pictures of dogs wearing hats. She hummed off-key tunes while she worked, and she had, against his better judgment, been allowed to get a small fishbowl for the office. Bartholomew was now a permanent, goggle-eyed resident of Sterling Innovations. Dylan told himself he was keeping her on as a probationary consultant on unconventional problem-solving. In reality, he was intrigued. She was a human anomaly, a variable he couldn't predict, and for a man whose life was built on predictable outcomes, she was utterly captivating. Her next incident occurred during the quarterly board meeting. Dylan was in the middle of a tense presentation, trying to explain a dip in quarterly profits to a group of stone-faced, 70-year-old board members who had known his grandfather. "As you can see from the projections," Dylan said, pointing to a complex graph, "while there was a short-term downturn, our long-term growth strategy remains robust." At that moment, the door to the boardroom creaked open. Khloe poked her head in, holding a tray with an assortment of colorful, lopsided cookies. "Cookie break," she whispered loudly. "I made them myself. They're oatmeal raisin, but I used chocolate chips instead of raisins because raisins are just sad wannabe grapes." The entire board turned to stare at her. Mr. Abernathy, the chairman, a man who hadn't smiled since the stock market crash of 1987, looked at her as if she were a hallucination. "Miss Jensen?" Dylan said through clenched teeth, his smile a tight, painful rictus. "We are in the middle of a board meeting." "I know," she said cheerfully. "That's why you need cookies. You all look so serious, it's like you're discussing the end of the world. But it's just money, right? No one's actually dying." She walked around the table, offering the tray. "Go on, have one. They're good for morale." Mr. Henderson, a notoriously grumpy board member, grumbled, "Young lady, this is highly unprofessional." "Is it?" Khloe asked, genuinely curious. She looked at his face. "You have a little frown line right here," she said, pointing to the spot between his eyebrows. "My grandma says that happens when you forget to be happy. Cookies help you remember." She offered the tray to him. He stared at her, then at the cookie, and to everyone's astonishment, he took one. He took a bite, chewed thoughtfully, and a strange, unfamiliar expression crossed his face. "These are surprisingly good," he mumbled. Soon, the other board members, their curiosity piqued, were tentatively taking cookies. The tense, formal atmosphere of the meeting began to dissolve. "You know," said Mr. Abernathy, munching on a cookie, "she has a point. We have been a bit morose lately." He then turned to Dylan. "Your fourth quarter projections are still concerning, but perhaps we should discuss them with a less apocalyptic tone." The rest of the meeting was surreal. The board members, now armed with cookies, discussed billion-dollar strategies with a newfound sense of collaboration and, dare he say it, humanity. When Khloe came back to collect the empty tray, Mr. Abernathy gave her a small, rare smile. "Excellent cookies, Miss Jensen. Excellent." After the board members left, Dylan found Khloe in the break room, washing the cookie tray. "You," he said, leaning against the doorframe, "are a menace." "I know," she said with a proud smile, "but a menace with good cookies. You insulted the board of directors." "No, I gave them a snack and some free life advice," she corrected. "They look like they needed it." He shook his head, a slow smile spreading across his face. He couldn't even be angry. She had somehow managed to do in 10 minutes with a plate of cookies what he had failed to do in years: get the board to act like human beings. "You are, without a doubt," he said, "the worst and most effective assistant I have ever had." "I'll take that as a compliment," she said, winking. "So, does this mean Bartholomew gets a little castle for his fishbowl?" Dylan looked at her bright, unapologetic, chaotic energy, and felt a laugh bubble up from a place deep inside him, a place he thought had long since been buried under layers of corporate responsibility and sterile perfection. "Fine," he sighed, feigning defeat. "Bartholomew can have his castle." He had no idea that her next act of chaos would be far less charming and have far more serious consequences. The week of the Japanese investors' visit was marked on Dylan's calendar in a shade of red that signified, "Do not allow any form of chaos within a 5-mile radius." The delegation from Mori Corp was notoriously traditional, valuing precision, respect, and above all, flawless protocol. A multi-billion-dollar deal to develop a new AI-driven logistics platform was on the line. It was the most important negotiation of Dylan's career. "Khloe," he said, summoning her to his office a day before their arrival. He had a whiteboard set up with a list of rules. "I need you to read this, memorize it, live by it for the next 48 hours. Khloe peered at the board. The list was extensive. 1. Do not speak unless spoken to. Do not offer cookies. 3. Do not refer to the lead investor Mr. Tanaka as Tanaki or any other nickname. 4. Bowing is the appropriate greeting. Do not attempt to high-five, fist bump, or hug. 5. Do not mention Bartholomew the fish." "Wow," she said, tapping her chin thoughtfully. "This is a very detailed how not to be me guide. You forgot one, though." "What did I forget?" Dylan asked, his patience already wearing thin. "Rule number 6, do not accidentally spill coffee." He stared at her for a long moment. "I am adding that to the list," he said, uncapping a marker. "In permanent ink." The day the Mori Corp delegation arrived, a tense, almost reverent silence fell over the 40th floor. The 4 investors, led by the venerable Mr. Tanaka, were the epitome of Japanese business decorum. They were polite, reserved, and their expressions were as unreadable as ancient hieroglyphs. Khloe, to Dylan's immense relief, a waiter was serving a platter of sizzling Wagyu beef when he stumbled slightly on the edge of the tatami mat. The platter tilted. A single perfectly seared piece of beef, coated in a dark, rich teriyaki sauce, went airborne. It flew through the air in what felt like slow motion, a saucy, meaty UFO on a collision course with destiny. And its destiny was Mr. Tanaka's pristine white shirt. The beef landed with a soft, devastating splat, leaving a large, dark, and very obvious stain right in the center of his chest. The silence that fell over the room was absolute and profound. The waiter froze in horror. The other investors stared, speechless. Dylan felt the blood drain from his face. This was it. The multi-billion-dollar deal had just been assassinated by a piece of flying beef. Khloe, however, did not freeze. Her brain, which seemed to operate on a different frequency from everyone else's, saw not a disaster, but a problem in need of a creative solution. Before Dylan could even begin to formulate an apology, Khloe jumped to her feet. "Oh my goodness," she exclaimed, not with panic, but with a strange, theatrical enthusiasm. "A sign. It's a sign from the culinary gods." Everyone stared at her. Mr. Tanaka looked down at the stain on his shirt, then at Khloe, his expression one of utter bewilderment. "In my country," Khloe announced, improvising at the speed of light, "when food lands on you during an important meal, it is a sign of immense good fortune. It means the partnership will be saucy and rich with success." She beamed at Mr. Tanaka, as if he had just won the lottery. Dylan buried his face in his hands, silently praying for the floor to open up and swallow him whole. The other investors exchanged confused glances. The waiter looked like he was about to commit seppuku with a butter knife. Mr. Tanaka continued to stare at Khloe, a flicker of something unwritable in his eyes. "Good fortune?" he repeated, his English slow and careful. "The best kind," Khloe said, now fully committed to her bizarre narrative. "The beef chose you, Mr. Tanaka. It is a great honor. It means you are the heart of the deal." She then did something that defied all laws of corporate protocol and possibly physics. She picked up her own piece of Wagyu beef with her chopsticks, looked at it with reverence, and with a small, theatrical bow, she deliberately dropped it onto her own dress. "There," she declared, pointing to the new stain on her black dress. "Now we are bound by the sacred pact of the rogue beef. Our success is sealed." Dylan slowly lifted his head from his hands, certain he was having an anxiety-induced hallucination. Khloe was standing there, a triumphant smile on her face, with a piece of teriyaki-soaked beef sitting proudly on her chest. The room remained in a state of stunned silence. Then, something extraordinary happened. Mr. Tanaka, the serious, reserved, and now saucy lead investor, looked at the stain on his shirt, then at the matching stain on Khloe's dress, and a low chuckle escaped his lips. The chuckle grew into a warm, genuine laugh. The other investors, seeing their leader laugh, hesitantly began to smile. The waiter, realizing he wasn't going to be fired, let out a shaky sigh of relief. "Miss Jensen," Mr. Tanaka said, still chuckling. "You are a most unusual young woman." "I get that a lot," Khloe said with a shrug. The tension in the room was completely broken. The rest of the dinner was a surreal but joyful affair. Mr. Tanaka, it turned out, had a wonderful sense of humor. He told stories about his own clumsy moments in business, and the other investors joined in. The formal, stilted negotiation had transformed into a warm, friendly dinner between new partners. "You know," Mr. Tanaka said to Dylan later, as they shared a cup of sake, "we have been in negotiations with your competitors for months. Their presentations were perfect, their numbers were flawless, but they were cold." He gestured with his cup towards Khloe, who was now enthusiastically explaining the rules of American football to one of the younger investors using soy sauce dishes as players. "Your company has a heart. It has a soul. That is something we value more than perfect projections." At the end of the evening, as they shook hands, Mr. Tanaka bowed to Dylan, then turned to Khloe and gave her a second, deeper bow. "Thank you for the good fortune, Miss Jensen," he said, a twinkle in his eye. "Anytime," she replied. "Next time, I'll try to use a less expensive tablecloth." Back in the hotel elevator, Dylan and Khloe stood in a comfortable silence. He looked at her, at the teriyaki stain still on her dress, and shook his head in disbelief. "A sacred pact of the rogue beef?" he asked, a slow smile spreading across his face. "I panicked," she said with a shrug. "It was either that or pretend I was having a sudden allergic reaction to politeness." He started to laugh. A real, unrestrained laugh that echoed in the small space. "You are, without a doubt, a complete and utter madwoman." "I know," she said proudly, "but you have to admit it worked. "It more than worked," he said, his expression turning serious. "You saved the deal, Khloe. Again." He stepped closer, the playful energy between them shifting into something more intense. "How do you do it? How do you turn every disaster into a triumph?" She looked up at him, her smile softening. "Maybe," she said softly, "it's because I don't see disasters. I just see opportunities for a different kind of story." He looked at her, at the brilliant, chaotic, and utterly captivating woman who had just sealed a multi-billion-dollar deal by sacrificing her dress to a piece of meat. "And what kind of story are we in, Khloe?" he asked, his voice a low murmur. She looked into his eyes, and the world seemed to narrow to the small, quiet space of the elevator. "I don't know," she whispered, "but I have a feeling it's going to be a good one." He leaned in and she met him halfway. The kiss was different from their first. It was no longer a question, but an answer. It was a kiss of shared victory, of mutual admiration, of two completely different worlds colliding and creating something new and wonderful. When the elevator doors dinged and opened onto their floor, they pulled apart, a little breathless, a new, unspoken understanding between them. As they walked down the hall to their separate rooms, Dylan knew that Khloe had been wrong about one thing. She hadn't just saved the deal. She was, in her own strange, chaotic way, saving him. Returning to New York was like waking up from a strange, wonderful dream. The sterile, white walls of Sterling Innovations felt colder. The silence of the 40th floor more pronounced. The kiss in the hotel elevator had changed the invisible contract between them. They were no longer just a CEO and his chaotic assistant. They were Dylan and Khloe, two people who had shared something real and were now completely unsure of what to do next. The office became a minefield of exquisite awkwardness. A simple "good morning" in the hallway felt charged with unspoken meaning. A shared glance across the break room was loaded with the memory of teriyaki sauce and shared laughter. They were trying to fall back into their professional roles, but the costumes no longer fit. Khloe, for her part, tried to bury herself in work. She meticulously organized Dylan's schedule, color-coding his appointments with a system so complex it looked like a modern art piece. She even alphabetized the files on his computer desktop, an act of organizational zeal that left him both impressed and slightly terrified. He could no longer find anything. "Khloe," he said, standing in her cubicle doorway one morning, holding a tablet. "I appreciate the initiative, but I've spent the last 10 minutes looking for the Q3 financial projections. Do you happen to know where they are?" "Of course," she said brightly. "They're in the F folder." "The F folder? Why the F folder?" "For finances, obviously," she said as if it were the most logical thing in the world. "I also created a P folder for projects, a C folder for clients, and a B folder for Bartholomew's feeding schedule." Dylan stared at her, then at his tablet. "Khloe, the entire company uses a numerical filing system, 03 for the third quarter. It's been the standard for 15 years. "Oh," she said, her cheerful expression faltering. "Well, my system has letters and colors. It's much more visually appealing." He shook his head, a slow smile spreading across his face. He couldn't even be mad. "Just send me a key to your new system, a legend, a decoder ring, whatever it is you've created." "You got it, boss," she said, giving him a mock salute. He walked away, smiling to himself. She was infuriating. She was brilliant. She was turning his perfectly ordered world upside down. And the scariest part was, he was starting to like it. Their new, undefined relationship was a source of endless speculation for the office staff. The whispers followed them everywhere. They were the office's favorite real-life sitcom, and everyone was watching. "Did you see them in the break room?" one analyst whispered to another. He was explaining the coffee machine to her. He has never been near the coffee machine. "I saw her teaching him how to properly water the office plants," a paralegal added. She told him he was drowning the ficus with his repressed emotions. The story of the sacred pact of the rogue beef had become a corporate legend, a tale told in hushed, reverent tones by the water cooler. The true test of their new dynamic, however, came not from a business crisis, but from a deeply personal one. A week after their return from Japan, Dylan received a call that shattered his carefully controlled world. It was from the private nursing home where his grandmother, Eleanor Sterling, resided. Eleanor was the true matriarch of the Sterling family. She was the one who had raised Dylan after his parents, always consumed by their social ambitions, had effectively outsourced his upbringing. She was his anchor, his confidant, the one person in the world who saw past the CEO and still saw the little boy who was afraid of the dark. But for the last few years, a cruel, creeping fog had been descending upon her mind. Alzheimer's. "Mr. Sterling," the head nurse said, her voice gentle but firm, "I think you should come. Your grandmother, she's been having a difficult few days. She's asking for you, and she's asking for a song." Dylan felt a cold knot tighten in his stomach. The song. It was a simple, silly lullaby his grandmother used to sing to him when he was a child, a song about a moonbeam sailor who collected stars in a silver bucket. It had been their secret, a password to a world of unconditional love. But in her more lucid moments, she had made him promise one thing. "When the time comes, Dylan," she had told him, her eyes clear and sharp, "when I start to forget who I am, I want you to be the one to sing the Moonbeam Sailor song to me, one last time. It's my last wish. Promise me." He had promised, and now the time had come. He arrived at the nursing home, a place of quiet antiseptic corridors and the faint, sweet smell of fading memories. He found his grandmother sitting in an armchair by the window, staring out at the garden, but not really seeing it. "Grandma?" he said softly. She turned, and for a moment her eyes lit up with recognition. "Dylan, my boy," she said, her voice a frail whisper. "You came." "Of course I came," he said, kneeling beside her chair and taking her thin, wrinkled hand in his. "It's time, isn't it?" she asked, her gaze suddenly lucid, full of a heartbreaking clarity. "The fog, it's getting thicker." He couldn't speak. He just squeezed her hand, his throat tight with unshed tears. "Sing me the song, Dylan," she whispered, her eyes pleading. "My last wish, the Moonbeam Sailor. Please." He opened his mouth. He knew the words. He knew the melody. He had sung it 1,000 times in his head, but no sound would come out. A wall of grief, of fear, of a deep, paralyzing sorrow had risen in his throat. He, the man who could command a boardroom, who could close billion-dollar deals, could not grant the simple, dying wish of the only person who had ever truly loved him. He tried again, but all that came out was a choked, ragged breath. He was failing her. In the most important moment, he was failing her. He sat there, holding her hand, for over an hour, the silence in the room a testament to his own heartbreaking inadequacy. Finally, a nurse gently told him that his grandmother had tired and fallen asleep. Defeated, he left, the promise he had made to her a heavy, jagged stone in his heart. He returned to the office a ghost. He canceled his meetings, locked his door, and sat at his desk staring at a photograph of his grandmother, a vibrant, smiling woman from a time before the fog. Khloe, who had been blissfully unaware of his personal crisis, knew something was wrong the moment she saw his empty chair. Dylan Sterling never missed a meeting. She found Arthur, who simply shook his head. "Family matter," was all he would say. Khloe, with her uncanny ability to sense emotional undercurrents, knew it was more than that. She spent the day feeling a gnawing sense of worry. That evening, unable to bear the uncertainty, she did something she knew was a complete overstep of her authority. She went to his penthouse. She used the emergency access code Arthur had once given her, her heart pounding. She found the apartment dark and silent. "Dylan," she called out softly. She found him in his study, sitting in the dark, the city lights painting stark shadows across his face. He was holding an old, black-and-white photograph. "What are you doing here?" he asked, his voice hollow, devoid of its usual energy. "I was worried," she said, stepping into the room. "Arthur said it was a family matter. I just wanted to make sure you were okay." He didn't answer. He just continued to stare at the photograph. "Is that your grandmother?" she asked gently, recognizing the woman from a picture she had seen on his desk. He nodded, still not looking at her. She's forgetting," he said, the words barely audible. "She's forgetting everything, me, my parents, herself." "Oh, Dylan," Clara whispered, her heart aching for him. "She made me promise," he said, his voice breaking. "She made me promise I would sing her a song, one last time, her favorite lullaby from when I was a kid." He let out a short, bitter laugh. "The great CEO, the man who controls everything, and I couldn't do it. I just froze. I couldn't make a sound." He finally looked at her, his eyes filled with a raw, profound pain she had never seen before. "I failed her, Khloe. I'm letting her slip away without granting her last wish." Khloe stood in the quiet, dark room, looking at the broken man in front of her. Her mind, which always worked in strange, creative ways, began to connect the dots. The stories he had told her about his grandmother, the way he had described her as his anchor, and a half-remembered conversation about his childhood. "What's the song about?" she asked softly. "A moonbeam sailor," he said, his voice thick with grief. "Who collects stars in a silver bucket?" Chloe's breath caught in her throat. She took a hesitant step closer. "And does it have a part that goes, 'Sail on, my darling, through the silver night'?" Dylan's head snapped up. He stared at her, his eyes wide with disbelief. How could you possibly know that?" "My mother," Khloe whispered, her own eyes now shining with tears. "She was a caregiver. She worked in a lot of private homes when I was a kid. Sometimes when her clients were having a hard night, she would sing them a song to help them sleep, an old, forgotten lullaby she had learned from her own grandmother." She took another step, her voice a gentle, trembling melody in the quiet room. "The moonbeam sailor, with his silver pail, gathers the stars that tell a silent tale." She was singing it. She was singing his grandmother's song. "Your mother," he began, his voice a choked whisper. "She worked as a caregiver?" "For a while," Khloe said, still singing softly. "For a family on the Upper East Side, a kind woman named Eleanor who had a little grandson who was afraid of the dark." The pieces of a story 25 years old clicked into place. His grandmother, Eleanor. Her mother, the caregiver. And the song, a bridge of comfort passed from one generation to another, now echoing in the quiet of his study. He looked at her, at this chaotic, wonderful woman who had crashed into his life, and realized their connection was not an accident. It was a story that had been written long ago, a melody waiting to be finished. "She's not gone yet, Dylan," Khloe said, her song finished. "It's not too late." He stood up, a new, desperate hope in his eyes. "What do we do?" Khloe took his hand, her grip firm and steady. "You go back there tomorrow," she said, her voice full of a gentle, unwavering strength. "And this time, you won't be singing alone." The next morning, the air in Dylan's penthouse was thick with a fragile, nervous energy. The ruthless CEO was gone, replaced by a man clinging to a sliver of hope so delicate he was afraid it might shatter. He paced the length of his living room, a space that suddenly felt too large and too empty, while he waited for Khloe. She arrived not as a corporate assistant, but as an ally. She wore simple jeans and a soft woolen sweater, her presence a comforting warmth in the stark, minimalist space. She was carrying her large tote bag, from which she produced not a laptop or a folder, but a thermos of chamomile tea and a small, worn, leather-bound book. "My mother's," she said, placing the book on the polished coffee table. "It's her journal. She used to write down the songs and stories she told her clients. I thought, maybe it could help." Dylan picked up the journal, his fingers tracing the faded gold lettering on the cover. He opened it, and on the first page, in a beautiful looping script, he saw the words to "The Moonbeam Sailor." Seeing the lyrics written down, a song that had only ever existed in his memory, felt like finding a map to a lost world. "She wrote about you, you know," Khloe said softly, pouring him a cup of tea. He looked up, his expression a mixture of surprise and a deep, aching nostalgia. "About me? She called you the little prince in the glass castle," Khloe said, reading from a page. "A serious boy with old eyes who was afraid of the dark, but never of the monsters in the stories. He said as long as he had the song, the monsters couldn't get him." A lump formed in Dylan's throat. He had been that boy, and he had completely forgotten. "Your mother," he began, his voice thick with emotion. She was a kind woman." "She was," Khloe agreed, a sad, gentle smile on her face. "She taught me that the most important work in the world is to be kind to those who are lost in the fog." They sat together for a while, the journal lying open between them, a bridge connecting their two disparate childhoods. He was the little prince in the glass castle. She was the daughter of the woman who brought him comfort. Their story wasn't new. It was an echo, a continuation. "Are you ready?" Khloe asked finally, her voice full of a quiet strength that seemed to bolster his own. He looked at the journal, at her steady, compassionate gaze, and for the first time in 24 hours, he felt a flicker of courage. He nodded. "Let's go." The atmosphere at the nursing home was the same. The quiet hum of medical equipment, The smell of lavender and antiseptic, the slow, timeless rhythm of a place where life was lived in the past tense. When they arrived at Eleanor's room, they found her awake, but the lucidity from the previous day was gone. She was staring out the window, her eyes clouded, her hands restlessly twisting a corner of her blanket. "Grandma?" Dylan said softly, kneeling by her chair. She turned her head slowly, but her eyes were vacant. There was no recognition. "Are you the man with the stars?" she asked, her voice a frail, distant whisper. Dylan's heart broke. He looked at Khloe, a desperate, helpless expression on his face. He had come to sing to her, but she didn't even know who he was. Khloe didn't panic. She moved slowly, calmly, and sat on the ottoman at Eleanor's feet. She didn't speak to her as a stranger, but as an old friend. "Hello, Eleanor," she said, her voice warm and gentle. "My name is Khloe. My mother Maria used to talk about you. She said you had the most beautiful garden on the Upper East Side." Eleanor's restless hands stilled for a moment. A flicker of something, a distant memory, moved behind her clouded eyes. "My roses," she murmured. "Did you see my roses?" "I did," Khloe lied softly. "They were beautiful." She had opened a door. She hadn't tried to force Eleanor back into the present. She had met her in the past. Dylan watched, mesmerized by her intuitive grace. Khloe then reached into her tote bag and pulled out a small, portable speaker. She had downloaded a simple instrumental piano version of The Moonbeam Sailor. She pressed play, and the soft, familiar melody began to fill the quiet room. Eleanor's head tilted, her ear turning toward the sound. "That song," she whispered. "I know that song." "We know it too," Khloe said gently. She looked at Dylan, her eyes full of encouragement. "We can sing it together." Dylan's throat was tight as a knot. The fear, the grief, the fear of failing her again, was paralyzing. He looked at his grandmother, lost in the fog, and then at Khloe, his steady, unwavering anchor. He took a deep, shaky breath. Khloe began to sing, her voice soft and clear. The Moonbeam Sailor, with his silver pail. Dylan closed his eyes. He heard Chloe's voice, he heard the piano, and he heard, in his memory, his grandmother's voice singing the same words to him in the dark. He opened his mouth, and this time, the words came. "Gathers the stars that tell a silent tale," he sang, his voice rough and unsteady at first, but growing stronger as he joined Chloe's. They sang together, their voices blending in a harmony that was both beautiful and heartbreaking. As they sang, a miracle began to happen. The fog in Eleanor's eyes began to clear. She turned her head and looked directly at Dylan. Her gaze was no longer vacant. It was focused. It was her. "Dylan," she whispered, a tear tracing a path down her wrinkled cheek. "My boy, you're singing." He couldn't speak. He just continued to sing, his own tears now falling freely, his voice choked with a love and a grief so profound it felt as if his heart were breaking and healing all at the same time. "Sail on, my darling, through the silver night." They sang the final verse together, their voices a quiet, reverent trio. When the song ended, the room was filled with a profound, peaceful silence. Eleanor's hand, which had been twisting the blanket, was now resting calmly in his. A small, serene smile was on her lips. "You kept your promise," she whispered, her eyes heavy. "My good boy, you always keep your promises." Her eyes drifted shut, not in sleep, but in a final, peaceful letting go. Dylan sat there, her hand still in his, as her breathing grew softer, and then simply stopped. He didn't move. He just knelt there, in the quiet, sunlit room, a silent witness to the gentle, graceful end of a life well lived. Khloe stayed beside him, her hand a warm, steady presence on his shoulder. She didn't offer condolences. "She's in a better place." She simply shared his silence, honoring his grief with her own. He had not failed her. He had been there. He had sung her the song. He had guided her on her final journey with the same lullabies she had used to guide him through the darkness of his childhood. It was a perfect, heartbreaking, and beautiful circle. The days following Eleanor's passing were a blur of arrangements and quiet mourning. Dylan, who had always handled grief by burying himself in work, found that he couldn't. The sterile logic of his corporate world offered no comfort. The only thing that did was Chloe's presence. She was his anchor. She didn't try to cheer him up or distract him. She simply was there. She would make him tea, sit with him in the silent study, or suggest a walk when the mansion felt too suffocating. She understood that grief was not a problem to be solved, but a landscape to be navigated, and she walked through it with him, every step of the way. It was during one of these quiet evenings, as they sat in the library, the fire crackling in the hearth, that Dylan finally found the words to express the shift that had occurred within him. "When I was in that room with her," he began, his voice a low murmur, "and we were singing that song, everything else just disappeared. The company, the deals, the money, none of it mattered." He looked at her, his eyes full of a new, profound clarity. All that mattered was that moment, being there, for her. "I know," she said softly. "For 20 years, he continued, I have been building an empire. I thought that was what it meant to be a man, to be successful, to be strong." He gave a short, bitter laugh. "But I couldn't even sing a simple song to the one person who truly loved me. I wasn't strong, Khloe. I was a coward. I was hiding behind my success." "You weren't a coward," she said, her voice firm but gentle. "You were just lost, and you found your way back." He looked at her, at the incredible, compassionate woman who had so effortlessly guided him home. "No," he said, "I didn't find my way back. You showed me the way." He stood up and walked to the window, not looking out at the glittering, indifferent city. "My grandmother's will is being read next week. It's mostly a formality. The bulk of the Sterling estate, the company, it all passes to me." He turned to face her. "And I don't want it." Khloe stared at him, completely taken aback. "What are you talking about?" "Sterling Innovations," he said, the name of his life's work sounding foreign on his own tongue. "It's a machine. A perfect, efficient, and completely soulless machine. It's the world my parents built, the world that almost crushed the humanity out of me. And I'm done with it." "Dylan, you can't just walk away from your own company," she said, her voice a mixture of shock and concern. "Can't I?" he asked, a new liberating light in his eyes. "You taught me that success isn't about profit margins, Khloe. It's about people. It's about building things that matter. Things that have a heart." He walked back to her and knelt down in front of her chair, taking her hands in his. "I don't know what I'm going to do next. Maybe I'll start a foundation. Maybe I'll fund projects that are creative and chaotic and have no clear business model. Maybe I'll just learn how to properly water a ficus." He smiled, a genuine, joyful smile that reached his eyes. "But I know one thing for sure. I don't want to do any of it without you." "Dylan," she began, her heart pounding. "I love you, Khloe Jensen," he said, the words simple, direct, and full of an unshakable certainty. "I love your chaos. I love your kindness. I love your terrible taste in office decor. You walked into my perfect, sterile world, and you didn't just spill coffee. You broke down the walls. You let the light in." He squeezed her hands. "I'm not offering you a position as my assistant anymore. I'm not offering you a job at all. I'm asking you to be my partner. In everything. In building a new life, a life that has a soul. Will you do that with me? Will you be my partner?" She looked at him, at the man who was willing to walk away from an empire for a chance at a real life, and her heart was so full of love she thought it might burst. She saw not a billionaire CEO, but the little boy who was afraid of the dark, now grown into a man who was brave enough to step into the light. "Yes," she whispered, her own voice choked with tears of happiness. "Yes, Dylan, I will." He didn't have a ring. He hadn't planned a grand proposal. It was just a simple, honest question, born from a moment of profound, life-altering truth, and it was more perfect than any scripted romance could ever be. The week of Eleanor's will reading was a stark reminder of the world Dylan was choosing to leave behind. The meeting was held in the cold, mahogany-paneled office of the family's ancient law firm, a place that smelled of old paper and older money. Dylan and Khloe sat on one side of the massive desk. On the other sat the board of directors of Sterling Innovations, including the stern, unsmiling chairman, Mr. Abernathy. They were the executors of Eleanor's will, a clear sign of how intertwined the family and the corporation had always been. The family lawyer, a man as dry as the legal documents he handled, read the will in a monotonous drone. As expected, the vast majority of the Sterling fortune, including the controlling shares of the company, was left to Dylan. But Eleanor, even in her final wishes, had a surprise. "And finally," the lawyer read, adjusting his spectacles, "to my beloved grandson Dylan, I leave one last piece of advice, which he is free to ignore, but which I hope he will not. The biggest risk in life is not taking one. Find what makes your heart sing, my boy, and don't you dare let it go." A heavy silence filled the room. The board members looked at Dylan, their expressions a mixture of condolence and impatient expectation. They were ready to get back to business. "Well, Mr. Baird," Abernathy said, clearing his throat. "A touching sentiment. Now, Dylan, with the formalities concluded, we need to discuss the Q4 projections and the leadership transition. Your grandmother's passing, while tragic, leaves you as the undisputed head of the company." Dylan looked at the men around the table, at their expensive suits and their faces etched with the quiet, relentless pressure of the bottom line. He saw his past and his potential future laid out before him. A life of quarterly projections and soulless efficiency. He took a deep breath, and then he took Khloe's hand under the table, her presence a silent source of strength. "Gentlemen," Dylan began, his voice calm but firm, "thank you for your stewardship during my grandmother's illness. However, there is going to be a significant change in the leadership of Sterling Innovations." The board members leaned forward, intrigued. "I am officially stepping down as CEO," Dylan announced. The collective intake of breath was the only sound in the room. Mr. Abernathy stared at him as if he had just announced he was joining the circus. "You're stepping down?" the chairman repeated, his voice dangerously low. "Dylan, have you lost your mind? This is your family's legacy. It's your birthright." "My grandmother's last wish," Dylan said, his gaze steady, "was for me to find what makes my heart sing, and it is not this." He gestured to the financial reports on the table. "For years, this company has been my entire identity, but I have come to realize that a life measured only in profit is a profoundly impoverished one." "This is because of her, isn't it?" Another board member, Mr. Henderson, sneered, nodding his head contemptuously toward Khloe. "This assistant? She's filled your head with these sentimental, unprofitable notions." Before Dylan could respond, Khloe spoke, her voice clear and strong, cutting through the tense atmosphere. "Mr. Henderson," she said, looking him directly in the eye, "I haven't filled his head with anything. He's simply started to listen to his own heart. Perhaps it's a practice the rest of the board might benefit from." The sheer audacity of her statement left the room speechless. The intern, the former dog walker, was lecturing a board of billionaires on emotional intelligence. Dylan squeezed her hand, a surge of pride and love washing over him. "This is absurd," Abernathy boomed, his face turning a mottled red. "Dylan, you can't just abandon a $10 billion corporation." "I'm not abandoning it," Dylan said calmly. "I am liberating it, and myself. I will be retaining my shares, but I am placing them in a blind trust. I will be stepping away from all day-to-day operations. My final act as CEO will be to promote my current COO, David Chen, to the position. He is a good man and a brilliant strategist. He will run the company with the integrity it deserves." He stood up, pulling Khloe with him. "And what, may I ask," Abernathy demanded, "do you plan to do with your time? Travel? Collect art? Become a recluse?" Dylan looked at Khloe, a wide, genuine smile spreading across his face. "I'm going into a new venture," he said. "A partnership." "A partnership? With whom?" "With Miss Jensen," Dylan said. "We're starting a foundation. It will be dedicated to funding creative chaos." The board members stared at him blankly. "We're going to invest in the kinds of ideas that don't fit on a spreadsheet," Dylan explained. "Art projects, community gardens, programs that teach kids how to sing off-key. Small, unprofitable, and utterly human endeavors. The kinds of things my grandmother would have loved." He looked at Khloe, his heart in his eyes. "The kinds of things that make a heart sing." He then turned and, with Khloe at his side, walked out of the room, leaving behind a group of stunned, speechless men and the echoing silence of a legacy being completely and joyfully redefined. Shh! They walked out of the law office and into the bright New York sunlight, a new, exhilarating sense of freedom surrounding them. "Creative chaos?" Khloe asked, a laugh bubbling up from her chest. "Is that our official business model?" "It is now," Dylan said, pulling her into a celebratory hug right there on the sidewalk. "Welcome to the Moonbeam Foundation, Miss Jensen. You are now the co-founder and Chief Imagination Officer." "Chief Imagination Officer," she repeated, laughing. "I love it. Does it come with a business card with stars on it?" "It can, and it will," he said, kissing her with a joy so pure and unrestrained that a passing taxi driver honked in approval. Their life began to take on a new, beautiful shape. They spent the next few months working out of a small rented office in Brooklyn, a space that was the complete opposite of the Sterling Innovations headquarters. The walls were covered in whiteboards filled with Khloe's colorful, chaotic mind maps. Bartholomew the fish had been relocated to a larger, more luxurious tank and now held the official title of Aquatic Morale Officer. They were a perfect team. Khloe, with her boundless creativity and intuitive understanding of people, would identify projects and individuals in need of a chance. Dylan, with his sharp business mind, would handle the structure, the finances, and the logistics to turn her chaotic ideas into viable realities. Their first project was to fund a struggling community theater that was about to lose its space. Their second was to create a mobile art studio for children in underserved neighborhoods. Their third was to start a scholarship for dog walkers who wanted to go to night school. They were small projects, drops in the vast ocean of the city's needs, but for the people they helped, they were everything. And as they worked together, building this new life, Dylan fell in love with Khloe all over again, in 100 small ways every day. He loved the way she would get a smudge of paint on her nose when she was excited about a new idea. He loved the way she would argue passionately with city officials for a new park permit. He loved the way she saw the world, not as a series of problems to be solved, but as a canvas waiting for more color. He knew he wanted to spend the rest of his life with her. The question in the study had been a confession. The next one had to be a promise. He spent weeks planning the proposal, using the same meticulous attention to detail he had once reserved for corporate takeovers. He wanted it to be perfect. Not perfect in the old, sterile, Sterling sense of the word, but perfect for her. He found a small, out-of-print book of his grandmother's favorite poems. He commissioned a local artisan to create a custom-made silver bucket, a replica of the one from the Moonbeam Sailor song, and he arranged for a private visit to the city's planetarium. The night of the proposal, he took her to the planetarium after it had closed to the public. They were alone in the vast circular room, the domed ceiling a dark, empty canvas. "What are we doing here?" Khloe asked, her voice echoing in the quiet space. "I wanted to show you the stars," he said, leading her to the center of the room. He gave a signal to the operator, and the lights dimmed. The ceiling above them exploded into a breathtaking, perfect replica of the night sky, 1,000,000 stars glittering in the darkness. "Oh, Dylan," she breathed, her eyes wide with wonder. "Khloe," he began, his heart pounding in his chest. "When I met you, my world was a lot like this room before the lights came on. It was dark and empty and silent." He took her hands in his. "You came into my life and you didn't just turn on the lights. You filled it with stars. You filled it with music. You taught me that the most beautiful things in the universe are not the perfectly ordered galaxies, but the chaotic, unpredictable, and brilliant constellations that make up a life." He gently let go of one of her hands and knelt down on one knee, holding up the small silver bucket. Inside, nestled on a bed of dark blue velvet, was a simple, elegant ring. It wasn't a massive diamond. It was a delicate band of white gold with a single, luminous moonstone that seemed to glow with its own soft light. "My grandmother taught me that true love is about finding the person who makes your heart sing," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "You, Khloe Jensen, are my song. You are my moonbeam sailor." He looked up at her, his entire soul in his eyes. "I know our story started with a mistake, and a lot of chaos, and a very unfortunate incident with a pair of pants. But I am asking you to make it a story that lasts forever. Will you marry me, Khloe?" She was crying, silent tears of overwhelming happiness tracing paths down her cheeks in the starlight. "Dylan Sterling?" she whispered, her voice a joyful, trembling melody. "You are my favorite kind of chaos." "Is that a yes?" he asked, his own eyes misty. "That," she said, laughing through her tears as she pulled him to his feet, "is the most definite yes in the history of the universe." He slid the moonstone ring onto her finger, and it shone like a tiny, captured star. He pulled her into his arms and they kissed, a long, sweet, and profoundly certain kiss, alone together under a canopy of 1,000,000 perfect man-made stars, their love the most real and brilliant constellation of all. The news of their engagement spread through their small but vibrant circle like a joyful wildfire. James was the first to find out, and his reaction was a rare and beautiful display of unrestrained happiness. Finally, he exclaimed, when Dylan showed him the moonstone ring. Sir, I must confess, I had already drafted a contingency plan in case you failed to propose. It involved a flash mob and a skywriter. I'm relieved I won't have to use it. Khloe's friends, a chaotic and fiercely loyal group of artists, dog walkers, and fellow comic book enthusiasts from her old Brooklyn neighborhood, were ecstatic. They threw a small, impromptu engagement party in her old apartment, a place filled with mismatched furniture and overflowing bookshelves. Dylan, the former Billionaire CEO, found himself sitting on a lumpy couch, drinking cheap beer from a bottle, and listening to stories about Khloe's disastrous attempts at pottery. He had never felt more at home. So, said Maria, Khloe's best friend and a fiery-haired sculptor, you're the guy who got hit by the Khloe hurricane. You survived. We're impressed. Barely, Dylan laughed, raising his bottle in a toast, but I wouldn't have it any other way. Planning the wedding became their first official project as co-founders of a life together, and they approached it with the same unique blend of chaos and strategy that now defined their relationship. Dylan, reverting to his old habits, initially tried to create a spreadsheet. Okay, he said one evening, his laptop open. Venue logistics, guest list management, catering cost-benefit analysis. We need to optimize the experience while maintaining fiscal responsibility. Khloe peered over his shoulder, a mischievous glint in her eye. She gently closed the laptop. Dylan, my love, she said, her voice full of affection. A wedding is not a corporate merger. It's a party, and the only fiscal responsibility we need is to make sure there are enough snacks for everyone. She pulled out a large sheet of drawing paper and a box of colored pencils. This, she declared, is our planning spreadsheet. Instead of columns and rows, she drew a large, sprawling tree. This is us, she said, drawing two stick figures holding hands at the base. The roots are the people who supported us. The branches are all the things we love. And the leaves are the memories we want to create. And so, their wedding plan took shape. Not as a list of tasks, but as a work of art. The guest list was a chaotic and beautiful mix of their two worlds. Mr. Abernathy and the other former board members of Sterling Innovations, who had, to their own surprise, become investors in the Moonbeam Foundation, would be seated next to the owner of Khloe's favorite comic book store. James would be the best man. Maria, the sculptor, would be the maid of honor, and Bartholomew the fish was given the official title of ring-bearer in spirit. For the venue, they chose not a grand hotel ballroom, but the Brooklyn Botanic Garden, a place of vibrant, natural beauty. It's a place where things are allowed to grow wild and beautiful, Khloe had said. It feels like us. The preparations were a joyful and often hilarious collaboration. Dylan discovered he had a hidden talent for flower arranging, a skill he had apparently absorbed from years of ignoring the elaborate floral displays in his own penthouse. Khloe discovered that negotiating with a caterer was surprisingly similar to dealing with a stubborn board member. Both responded well to a firm but friendly approach and the occasional offer of a cookie. It was during this time that Khloe made a decision that was, for her, a final act of letting go of the past. The old Sterling mansion, which had been sitting empty since Dylan stepped down, was still legally his property. I know what we should do with it, she said to him one afternoon. She took him back to the vast, white, minimalist house. It felt like a relic from another life. This place, she said, her voice echoing in the empty salon, is a monument to loneliness, but it has good bones and a lot of windows. What are you suggesting? He asked, though he was beginning to recognize the look of a brilliant, chaotic idea forming in her eyes. Let's donate it, she said. Let's turn it into the first Moonbeam home, a residence for young artists, writers, and creative thinkers who need a place to live and work. We can turn the offices into studios, the bedrooms into living quarters. We can turn this glass castle into a real community. Dylan looked around at the house that had been his gilded cage for so long. The idea of filling its silent, sterile rooms with the noisy, messy, beautiful chaos of creation was the most perfect, redemptive act he could imagine. That, he said, pulling her into his arms, is the most brilliant idea you've ever had. He kissed her, and in that kiss, the last ghost of the lonely little prince was finally and completely laid to rest. Their wedding day was a masterpiece of perfect imperfection. The sun shone, The flowers bloomed, and Bartholomew the fish, in his bowl on the gift table, watched the proceedings with a stoic, goggle-eyed dignity. Khloe wore a simple, elegant dress she had designed herself, with tiny hand-embroidered moonbeams on the hem. Dylan wore a classic tuxedo, but in place of a traditional boutonniere, he wore a small, perfectly folded origami frog Khloe had made for him, a nod to the day he had heard his own son laugh for the first time. The ceremony was held under a sprawling, ancient oak tree. There was no long, formal aisle. Instead, Dylan and Khloe walked towards each other from opposite sides of the garden, meeting in the middle, a symbol of their two worlds coming together. Their vows were a reflection of their journey, a mixture of profound love and gentle humor. "Khloe," Dylan began, his voice steady but his eyes shining with tears. "You came into my life like a beautiful, chaotic storm. You deleted my files, you insulted my board of directors, you made me question everything I thought I knew about success. And in doing so, you saved me. You are my greatest, most wonderful, and most unpredictable variable. I promise to spend the rest of my life embracing your chaos, celebrating your light, and trying my best to keep up." Khloe laughed through her own tears. "Dylan," she said, squeezing his hands, "you were the most organized, serious, and intimidating man I had ever met. You lived in a world of spreadsheets and silence, and you let me, a girl who communicates in doodles and off-key humming, into that world. You taught me that strength isn't about never falling, it's about having the courage to get back up. You saw a partner in the world's worst assistant. I promise to always keep your files mostly organized. I promise to keep bringing you cookies. And I promise to love you in all your perfect, beautiful order for the rest of my days." When they were pronounced husband and wife, the small crowd erupted in a cheer so joyful it seemed to make the very flowers bloom brighter. Their first kiss as a married couple was not a delicate, polite peck. It was a real kiss, full of laughter and love and the promise of a lifetime of beautiful, chaotic adventures. The reception was a party, not a formal affair. There was a jazz band, a taco truck, and a dessert table laden with every kind of cookie imaginable. Dylan, the man who once couldn't sing a lullaby, was pulled into an impromptu karaoke session with Khloe's friends, where he delivered a surprisingly heartfelt, if slightly off-key, rendition of a classic love song. Later in the evening, as the party swirled around them, Dylan and Khloe slipped away for a quiet moment. They stood under the same ancient oak tree where they had exchanged their vows, the sound of music and laughter a soft, happy backdrop. "Happy, Mrs. Sterling?" he asked, wrapping his arms around her. "Beyond happy," she said, leaning her head on his shoulder. "But you know, I think I'll keep the name Jensen, professionally at least. Khloe Jensen, Chief Imagination Officer. It has a nice ring to it." He laughed. "I wouldn't have it any other way." He looked up through the branches of the tree at the night sky, where the first stars were beginning to appear. "Look," he whispered. "The moonbeam sailor is on his way." She smiled, a slow, beautiful smile that still made his heart skip a beat. "He doesn't need to collect the stars tonight," she said, turning in his arms to face him. "We have all the light we need, right here." He looked into her eyes, at the woman who was his partner, his best friend, his entire universe. "Yes," he said, his voice full of a love that was as vast and as bright as the starry sky above them. "We do." He leaned in to kiss her, and in that perfect, quiet moment, they were not a billionaire and a former dog walker. They were just two people, a constellation of their own making, who had found in each other's chaotic, beautiful, and perfectly imperfect worlds, there forever. Married life, Dylan and Khloe quickly discovered, was a beautiful, chaotic, and incredibly productive symphony. Their small Brooklyn office buzzed with the energy of a startup run on passion, creativity, and a frankly alarming amount of coffee. The Moonbeam Foundation, once just a rebellious idea born in a lawyer's office, was rapidly becoming a powerful force for good in the city. Khloe, as the Chief Imagination Officer, was in her element. She had a unique and uncanny ability to find the sparks of magic in the most overlooked corners of the city. She would spend her days meeting with struggling artists, grassroots community organizers, and aspiring inventors, her tote bag always filled with cookies and an infectious enthusiasm. She didn't just fund projects, she became a part of them, a cheerleader, a mentor, and often a co-conspirator in creative chaos. Dylan, for his part, found a new and profound joy in his work. He was still a brilliant strategist, but now his skills were applied to building sustainable models for nonprofits, to navigating the labyrinthine bureaucracy of city permits for a new community garden, and to ensuring that every dollar they invested had the maximum human impact. He had traded the cold hard logic of profit margins for the infinitely more complex and rewarding mathematics of changing lives. Their most ambitious project was the transformation of the old Sterling mansion. The Moonbeam Home for Creatives was a massive undertaking. They didn't just renovate it, they reimagined it. The sterile, white rooms were repainted in warm, vibrant colors. The minimalist sculptures were replaced with art created by the very artists the foundation was supporting. The vast, silent kitchen was now a communal space, the heart of the home, where residents would gather to share meals, ideas, and the occasional burnt casserole. Dylan and Khloe were there every step of the way, often with paint smudges on their clothes and sawdust in their hair. They worked alongside the contractors and volunteers, their partnership a seamless blend of his practicality and her vision. He would ensure the new plumbing was up to code. She would ensure the new common room had the perfect, cozy lighting for late-night brainstorming sessions. It was during one of these renovation days that Khloe, who had been feeling unusually tired for a week, suddenly sat down on a paint-splattered drop cloth, a strange, dizzy spell washing over her. "Are you all right?" Dylan asked, immediately rushing to her side, his face etched with concern. She smiled, a slow, secret smile that he hadn't seen before. "I'm better than all right," she said, taking his hand and placing it gently on her belly. I think our foundation is about to have its first and most important new resident." He stared at her, then at her hand, his brilliant CEO mind for once slow to process the data. And then his eyes widened with a dawning, incredulous joy. Are we?" He stammered, his voice a choked whisper. "Yes," she said, her own eyes shining with tears of happiness. "We are." He let out a whoop of pure, unadulterated joy, a sound so loud and unrestrained it echoed through the empty mansion. He lifted her up and spun her around, his laughter mixing with her own, a beautiful, chaotic symphony of happiness. The man who had once built a fortress around his heart was now about to build a family. The 9 months that followed were a whirlwind of joyful anticipation. Khloe's pregnancy was, in true Khloe fashion, a creative and slightly chaotic affair. She documented her growing belly with a series of hilarious weekly photos, comparing its size to various fruits, vegetables, and occasionally small household appliances. Week 20, baby is the size of a banana. Also, I have developed a strange craving for peanut butter and pickle sandwiches. Dylan was a doting, almost comically overprotective, expectant father. He read every pregnancy book he could find, highlighting passages and leaving studious notes in the margins. He insisted on accompanying her to every doctor's appointment, where he would ask the obstetrician a series of highly detailed spreadsheet-worthy questions about fetal development and nutritional requirements, much to the doctor's amusement. Their home, their real home, the one they had designed together in the countryside, was finally finished. They moved in a month before the baby was due. It was everything they had dreamed of, a house filled with light, with art, with comfortable, lived-in spaces. It was a hug made of wood and glass. The nursery was Khloe's masterpiece. She had painted a sprawling, magical mural on the walls, a whimsical landscape filled with moonbeam sailors, star-collecting buckets, and friendly, hat-wearing dogs. In the center of the ceiling, she had painted a glowing, silver moon. Their daughter, Eleanor Nora Maria Jensen Sterling, was born on a crisp autumn morning, arriving in the world with a healthy cry and a tuft of dark hair that hinted at her mother's rebellious spirit. Dylan held her for the first time, his large, capable hands looking impossibly clumsy as they cradled the tiny sleeping infant. He looked at Khloe, who was exhausted but radiant, and felt a wave of love so profound it was almost painful. All the mergers, all the acquisitions, all the billions of dollars, they were nothing compared to this. This tiny, breathing miracle. This was real wealth. Life with a newborn was a humbling, sleep-deprived, and utterly joyful adventure. Dylan, the man who once ran his life on a to-the-minute schedule, now found his days dictated by feeding times and diaper changes. He learned to function on 3 hours of sleep. He became an expert at assembling complicated baby swings. He discovered that the most soothing sound in the world was not the quiet, empty silence he once craved, but the soft, milky sighs of his daughter sleeping on his chest. Khloe, in turn, blossomed into motherhood with a natural, chaotic grace that amazed him. She was patient, intuitive, and seemed to have an endless well of love and energy. She would sing old, half-forgotten lullabies to Nora, her voice soft and sweet, and Dylan would find himself stopping in the doorway just to listen, his heart full. Their home became a haven. James became Uncle James, the official provider of ridiculously expensive but incredibly soft baby blankets. Maria became Aunt Maria, the designated creator of strange, abstract mobiles that Nora found fascinating. Bartholomew the fish was given a place of honor in the nursery, his stoic presence apparently very calming to a fussy baby. They were a family, a loud, messy, imperfect, and incredibly happy one. The Moonbeam Foundation, under the guidance of a board they now fully trusted, continued to thrive. The Moonbeam Home for Creatives had a waiting list a mile long and was already producing groundbreaking new art. Dylan found a new balance in his own life. He still managed his investments and sat on several boards, but his priorities had been fundamentally and permanently reordered. He became a fierce advocate for paternity leave and flexible work schedules in the corporate world, a position that shocked and secretly impressed his old colleagues. It was on Nora's first birthday that the final, beautiful piece of their story clicked into place. They had thrown a small party in the backyard of their country home. The garden was filled with their friends, the sound of laughter, and the happy squeals of children. Khloe was sitting on a blanket, watching as Dylan pushed a giggling Nora on a small swing he had built. He was making silly faces, his tie loosened, his perfectly tailored suit jacket long since discarded on a lawn chair. He looked boyish, carefree, and completely, utterly happy. She pulled out a small sketchbook, the one he had given her what felt like a lifetime ago, and began to draw. She sketched the scene before her, the man she loved, the daughter they had created, the home they had built. A simple, perfect moment of ordinary, extraordinary joy. Later that evening, after the guests had left and Nora was asleep in her crib, Dylan found Khloe in her studio, looking at the finished sketch. "What's that?" he asked, wrapping his arms around her from behind. "It's the next exhibit for the gallery," she said, her voice soft. "It's a new series I'm starting. It's called The Architecture of Happiness." He looked at the drawing, at the simple, perfect lines that captured the love and the laughter of their life. "And what's the first piece?" he asked, kissing the top of her head. She smiled, leaning back against him, her heart full to bursting. "It's called The CEO, the Assistant, and the Fish Who Knew Everything," she said. He laughed, a deep, joyful sound that echoed through their quiet, happy home. Their life was a testament to a simple, profound truth. The greatest, most beautiful structures are not built with steel and glass, but with the chaotic, resilient, and life-changing power of love. The years that followed were not a fairy tale ending, but a real-life continuation. A sprawling, beautiful, and often messy epic written day by day. The Moonbeam Foundation, under Khloe and Dylan's joint leadership, grew into an institution. It became a national model for a new kind of philanthropy, one that was less about charity and more about empowerment, less about grand gestures, and more about sustained, grassroots support. The Moonbeam Home for Creatives became a legendary incubator for talent, producing award-winning playwrights, groundbreaking artists, and innovative thinkers. It was a place known for its chaotic energy, its fierce sense of community, and its excellent, if occasionally burnt, cookies, a tradition Khloe had insisted upon. Dylan and Khloe as a couple settled into a partnership that was the envy of everyone who knew them. They were a perfect complementary whole. He was the steady strategic anchor, she was the brilliant chaotic sail, always catching the wind of a new idea. They still argued about everything from multi-million-dollar investment strategies for the foundation to who had forgotten to buy milk. But their arguments were always underscored by a deep, unwavering foundation of love and mutual respect. Their family life was the true heart of their world. Nora grew from a happy, gurgling baby into a bright, inquisitive, and wonderfully chaotic little girl. She had her father's sharp, analytical mind and her mother's boundless, artistic soul. She was a walking, talking, finger-painting embodiment of their love story. She would spend hours in Khloe's studio, her small hands covered in paint, creating what she called important art. She would then follow Dylan into his home office, where she would sit in a tiny armchair, helping him with his work by offering her surprisingly insightful 5-year-old opinions on his spreadsheets. "Daddy, this graph needs more purple. Purple is a very serious business color." Their home in the countryside was a sanctuary, a place filled with the sounds of laughter, the smell of baking, and the happy barking of the 3 rescue dogs Khloe had insisted they adopt. It was a home built not just of wood and glass, but of shared moments, of bedtime stories, of scraped knees and comforting hugs. It was on Nora's 7th birthday that their story came full circle in a way that was both beautiful and deeply poignant. The party was a chaotic, joyful affair in their backyard. The entire extended family they had built was there. James, Maria, the artists from the Moonbeam home, the young entrepreneurs from Khloe's old neighborhood. In the middle of the party, Nora, her face smeared with chocolate cake, ran up to her father, her eyes shining with a serious 7-year-old purpose. "Daddy," she announced, "I have a new idea for the foundation." Dylan knelt down, giving her his full attention. "Oh? And what's that, my little chief imagination officer?" "We need to build a special house," she said, her expression grave. "A house for grandmas who are starting to forget." Dylan's breath caught in his throat. He looked at Khloe, who was watching them, a gentle, understanding smile on her face. They had told Nora stories about her great-grandmother, Eleanor, about her kindness, about her foggy memory, about the song. "It would be a beautiful house," Nora continued, now in full planning mode, "with a big garden for roses, and lots of windows to let the sunshine in. And in every room there would be a music box that plays a happy song, so they never feel scared of the dark." Dylan felt a familiar tightness in his throat, but this time it was not of grief, but of a profound, overwhelming love. He looked at his daughter, at this perfect, compassionate little girl who had so effortlessly absorbed the most important lessons of their lives. He saw his grandmother's legacy, not in a company or a fortune, but in the heart of his child. He pulled her into a tight hug. "That," he said, his voice thick with emotion, "is the best idea I have ever heard." The Eleanor Sterling Home for Memory Care became the Moonbeam Foundation's most ambitious and most personal project. It was designed from the ground up by Khloe, Dylan, and Nora, who served as a very vocal and very creative consultant. It was not an institution. It was a home, built on the principles of kindness, dignity, and the healing power of music and memory. On the day of its grand opening, a few years later, Dylan stood at the podium, looking out at the crowd. He was older now, his hair tinged with a little more silver at the temples, his face softened by years of happiness. Khloe stood beside him, her hand in his, their partnership as strong and as steady as ever. A teenage Nora was in the front row, already a budding artist and a passionate social advocate. "My grandmother," Dylan began, his voice clear and steady, "once told me that the biggest risk in life is not taking one. For a long time, I thought she was talking about business. I built an empire on that idea, on calculated risks and strategic gambles." He paused, his gaze finding Khloe's. "I was wrong. The biggest risk I ever took had nothing to do with money. It was a clerical error, a case of mistaken identity, and a very unfortunate incident with a pair of pants." A warm, knowing laughter rippled through the crowd. "That day," he continued, "a whirlwind of chaotic, beautiful, and utterly unpredictable energy walked into my life. She didn't have a perfect resume. She didn't follow the rules. She spilled coffee, insulted my board of directors, and decorated my sterile, minimalist world with fairy lights and a fish named Bartholomew." He smiled, a genuine, heartfelt smile that reached every corner of the garden. "She was, by all corporate standards, the world's worst assistant. And she was, without a single doubt, the best thing that ever happened to me." He turned to Khloe, his heart in his eyes. "She taught me that a life is not measured by what you build, but by who you love. She taught me that a home is not a place, but a feeling. And she taught me that sometimes the most logical thing in the world is to throw away the spreadsheet and just follow the song in your heart." He raised a glass to the new building, a beautiful sunlit sanctuary behind him. "This home is a testament to my grandmother's legacy, But it is also a testament to the legacy of the woman standing beside me. A legacy of kindness, of chaos, and of a love that is brave enough to see a broken, lonely man and believe he is worth saving. He turned to his wife, his partner, his chief imagination officer. To Khloe, he said, his voice full of a love that had only deepened with time. "Thank you for being my favorite kind of chaos." She smiled, her own eyes shining with tears. "And thank you, Dylan," she whispered, so only he could hear, "for being the most beautiful, orderly, and wonderful home I could ever have imagined." They stood together, hand in hand, looking out at the legacy they had built, a legacy not of buildings and billions, but of second chances, of singing hearts, and of a love story that had started with a mistake and had ended up being the most perfect, right, and beautiful thing of all. What did you think of the story of Dylan and Khloe? On a scale of 0 to 10, how would you rate their chaotic and beautiful journey to love? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. And for everyone who has stayed with us to the very end, who believes that sometimes the greatest love stories are the ones that don't follow any of the rules, please comment with a simple moonbeam. We are so grateful to share these stories with you. Thank you for watching, and don't forget to subscribe for more narratives that will change the world.